What would make a hospice nurse abandon everything she believed about the mind, memory, and what happens when we die? Today, you'll hear the story of Rebecca Martinez, who spent a decade guiding patients through their final breaths. Until one fragile, older woman diagnosed with Alzheimer's made Rebecca question everything she thought she knew. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe. We're on a mission to reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Like the video and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and prepare for a story that might just change the way you see consciousness, death, and what might come after. There are moments in life when reality fractures, when the solid ground beneath your feet suddenly reveals itself to be nothing more than a thin veneer covering an abyss of impossible truths. I experienced such a moment 18 months ago, and the reverberations of that encounter continue to reshape everything I thought I knew about consciousness, identity, and the nature of human existence itself. My name is Rebecca Martinez, and for 10 years, I worked as a hospice nurse at Serenity Gardens, a small residential facility nestled in the mountains of northern Colorado. I had always found comfort in the predictable rhythms of end-of-life care, the gentle routines, the quiet conversations, the peaceful transitions from life to whatever comes after. Death, I believed, was the most natural thing in the world, as inevitable and orderly as the changing of seasons. I was wrong about everything. The patient who changed my understanding of reality was Mrs. Vivian Thorne, an 82-year-old former psychology professor who arrived at our facility on a cold February evening. According to her medical records, she was suffering from advanced Alzheimer's disease and had perhaps weeks to live. Her daughter, Dr. Amanda Thorne, was a neuroscientist who had reluctantly placed her mother in our care after exhausting all other options. What made Mrs. Thorne's case unusual wasn't her medical condition. We had cared for many Alzheimer's patients over the years. What made her extraordinary was what happened during her lucid moments, brief windows of clarity that seemed to defy everything we understood about her disease. During these episodes, Mrs. Thorne would speak with perfect coherence about events and people that, according to her daughter, she had never experienced or known. She would describe in vivid detail conversations with people who had died decades before Mrs. Thorne was born. Most disturbing of all, she would sometimes look directly at me and call me by names I had never heard, speaking to me as if we shared memories that I knew we had never created together. At first, I attributed these episodes to the complex nature of dementia. The brain, I reasoned, was simply creating false memories and confabulations as it deteriorated. But as the days passed, Mrs. Thorne's hallucinations became increasingly specific and consistent. She would describe the exact layout of rooms that had been remodeled before she moved to Colorado. She would mention names and details that seemed too precise to be random fabrications. I found myself caught between skepticism and a growing sense of unease. The breakthrough came during my third week caring for Mrs. Thorne. I was sitting with her during one of her lucid periods when she suddenly grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "Rebecca," she said, her eyes focusing on mine with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "You need to understand what's happening to me. This isn't dementia. This isn't my brain failing. This is something else entirely." "Mrs. Thorne, you're confused. The disease affects memory and—" "I'm not confused," she interrupted. "I'm remembering, but I'm not remembering my own life. I'm remembering theirs." "Whose memories?" She released my hand and leaned back against her pillows, her expression becoming distant. "The others who died here. Their memories, their experiences, they're all still here, Rebecca. They're trapped in this place, and somehow, I'm accessing them." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Mrs. Thorne, that's not possible. Memory doesn't work that way." "Doesn't it?" she asked, fixing me with that penetrating stare again. "Tell me, Rebecca, what do you know about the history of this building?" I realized that despite working at Serenity Gardens for several years, I knew very little about its past. The facility had been converted from a private residence in the 1990s, but I had never inquired about its earlier history. "I see you don't know," Mrs. Thorne continued. "This house was built in the 1920s by a man who believed in spiritualism and the possibility of communicating with the dead. He designed this house as a kind of spiritual laboratory." "How do you know all this?" "Because I'm remembering it through the eyes of his daughter, Margaret. She died in this house in 1947. I can see her memories as clearly as my own. Clearer, actually, because her mind wasn't clouded by disease." Over the following days, I found myself drawn into Mrs. Thorne's strange claims. During her lucid periods, she would share detailed accounts of life in the house during different eras, but always from the perspective of two specific people: Margaret, the spiritualist's daughter, and Thomas, a man who had died in a fire sometime in the 1960s. What made these accounts so unsettling was their emotional consistency. When Mrs. Thorne spoke as Margaret, her entire demeanor would change. She would become more refined, speaking with a slight accent that wasn't her own, humming classical melodies that she claimed Margaret had loved. When channeling Thomas, she would exhibit protective instincts and worry about others with a working-class directness that was completely unlike her usual reserved personality. Driven by curiosity and a growing sense of unease, I began researching the history of our building during my off hours. What I discovered in the local historical society's archives was fragmentary but disturbing. There were references to a Margaret in some old correspondence, though the handwriting was difficult to decipher and the context unclear. I found records of a fire at the address in the 1960s, but the details were sparse, just a brief newspaper mention of casualties, including someone with the surname Morrison. The evidence was tantalizing but incomplete. Nothing I found definitively proved Mrs. Thorne's claims, but nothing contradicted them either. The gaps in the historical record seemed to leave just enough space for her impossible memories to exist. But it was during one of Mrs. Thorne's episodes that I experienced something that shook me to my core. She had been channeling Margaret's memories when she suddenly looked directly at me and said, "You remind me of my sister Catherine. She had your same kind eyes, your same gentle way of moving through the world." The words themselves weren't particularly remarkable, but as she spoke them, I felt something I had never experienced before. A sudden, overwhelming sense of familiarity, as if I were remembering something I had forgotten. For just a moment, I could almost see myself through Margaret's eyes, could almost feel the warmth of a sisterly bond that had never existed in my own life. The sensation lasted only seconds, but it left me shaken. I began to doubt not just what I was witnessing, but what I thought I knew about the nature of memory and identity itself. As Mrs. Thorne's condition continued to deteriorate physically, her access to these foreign memories seemed to intensify. She would spend hours recounting the life stories of Margaret and Thomas, speaking with such intimate knowledge that it was as if she had lived their lives herself. But it was the emotional authenticity of these episodes that was most convincing, the way she would tear up when describing Margaret's loneliness after her father's death, or the urgency in her voice when channeling Thomas's memories of trying to save others during the fire. The most disturbing aspect of these episodes was how they affected Mrs. Thorne's sense of self. During her lucid moments, she would express confusion about her own identity, unsure which memories belonged to her and which belonged to the others. "I remember being a child in this house," she told me one evening, "playing in the garden with my sister. But I also remember being a man, trying to save people from smoke and flames. How can I remember all of these lives, Rebecca? How can I be all of these people?" I had no answer for her. Nothing in my medical training had prepared me for a situation like this. I consulted with Dr. Amanda Thorne, Mrs. Thorne's daughter, but she was equally baffled by her mother's condition. The neurological damage from Alzheimer's should make these kinds of detailed, coherent memories impossible, Dr. Thorne explained during one of our conversations. What my mother is experiencing defies everything we know about neuroscience. It was Dr. Thorne who suggested that we document her mother's claims more systematically. Together, we began recording Mrs. Thorne's accounts, though we kept our investigation private and limited. What emerged was a portrait of two distinct personalities, Margaret and Thomas, whose stories seemed to interweave through the history of the house. Margaret appeared to have been a sensitive, artistic woman who had lived in the house during the 1920s and 1940s. Through Mrs. Thorne's channeling, she spoke of seances held in the parlor, of her father's obsession with contacting the dead, and of her own growing ability to sense the presence of spirits in the house. She had died young, apparently of tuberculosis, but not before experiencing what she described as a profound connection to the consciousness of others who had passed away in the house. Thomas was different, a practical man who had worked as a caretaker for the house when it was converted to a boarding house in the 1960s. His memories, as channeled through Mrs. Thorne, were filled with concern for the residents, particularly the elderly and infirm. He had died trying to save others during an electrical fire, and his consciousness seemed to carry the weight of that final, heroic act. What struck me most about these two personalities was how distinct they were from Mrs. Thorne's own character and how consistent they remained across multiple episodes. Margaret was always refined and melancholy, with a love of music and poetry. Thomas was always protective and practical, with a tendency to worry about others' welfare. These weren't variations of Mrs. Thorne's personality. They were completely different people who happened to be using her brain as a temporary host. As Mrs. Thorne's physical condition continued to decline, I found myself changing in ways I couldn't fully understand. The certainty I had once felt about the nature of death and consciousness was eroding, replaced by a growing sense of wonder and uncertainty. I began to listen more carefully to all my patients, paying attention to their final words and their claims of seeing deceased relatives. I started to view death not as a termination, but as something more mysterious, a transition whose true nature we might not fully comprehend. During one particularly intense episode, Mrs. Thorne channeled both Margaret and Thomas simultaneously, conducting what appeared to be a conversation between them. She would speak in Margaret's refined voice, then pause and respond in Thomas's more direct manner, as if facilitating a dialogue between two old friends who had been separated by decades. "The fire wasn't your fault," she said in Margaret's voice. "You saved 3 people that night." Then, switching to Thomas's voice, "But I couldn't save them all. Mrs. Henderson was too frightened to move." "You did what you could," Margaret's voice replied. "That's all any of us can do." Watching this exchange, I felt as if I were witnessing something sacred, a reunion of consciousness that transcended the boundaries of life and death. Whether it was real or simply the product of Mrs. Thorne's deteriorating mind, it carried an emotional weight that was undeniably powerful. As Mrs. Thorne's final days approached, her episodes became more frequent and more peaceful. She would sometimes spend entire afternoons living in the past, experiencing the lives of Margaret and Thomas as if they were her own. During these episodes, she seemed happier and more at peace than she had been since her arrival. "I understand now," she told me during one of her final lucid moments. "This isn't a curse or a disease. It's a gift. Margaret and Thomas, they're not really gone. They're still here, still part of the fabric of this place, and somehow, I've been chosen to be their voice, to ensure that their stories aren't forgotten." The most remarkable episode occurred just days before Mrs. Thorne's death. She had mainly been unresponsive for hours when she suddenly sat up in bed, her eyes bright and alert. "They're both here," she said, looking around the room as if seeing people I couldn't perceive. "Margaret and Thomas. They've come to welcome me, to help me understand what comes next." For the next hour, Mrs. Thorne conducted what could only be described as a 3-way conversation. She would speak in her own voice, then pause as if listening to responses, then reply in either Margaret's or Thomas's voice. It was as if she were serving as a translator between different levels of consciousness. "Yes, I understand," she said at one point in her own voice. "The memories, the experiences, they're not lost when we die. They become part of something larger, something that connects us all." Mrs. Thorne passed away peacefully that evening, surrounded by her daughter and the staff who had come to care for her deeply. Her death was exactly what we hoped for in hospice care, dignified, comfortable, and surrounded by love. But Mrs. Thorne's death marked the end of the extraordinary phenomenon we had witnessed. In the days and weeks that followed, no other patients at Serenity Gardens reported similar experiences. The consciousness transfers, the channeling of Margaret and Thomas, all of it seemed to have died with Mrs. Thorne. Dr. Amanda Thorne and I continued to study the recordings we had made, but we kept our investigation private. Dr. Thorne was concerned that publicizing her mother's case might lead to unwanted attention or exploitation of vulnerable patients. She wrote a brief account of the experience, but it was never published, shared only with a few trusted colleagues who were studying consciousness and near-death experiences. For me, the impact of Mrs. Thorne's case was profound and lasting. Her experiences had shattered my understanding of death as a final ending. If consciousness could somehow persist and be accessed by others, then death was not the absolute boundary I had always believed it to be. This realization changed how I approached my work as a hospice nurse. I began listening more carefully to my patients' final words, paying attention to their claims of seeing deceased relatives or experiencing memories that didn't seem to be their own. I started to view death not as a termination, but as a transformation, a transition from individual consciousness to something larger and more interconnected. The room where Mrs. Thorne had stayed became one of the most peaceful spaces in our facility. Subsequent patients who occupied it reported unusually restful sleep and a sense of comfort that they couldn't quite explain. Some spoke of dreams in which they were visited by a kind older woman who would sit beside their bed and hold their hand. Others mentioned feeling watched over by a protective presence, as if someone were ensuring their safety during their final days. I often worked in that room during my remaining months at Serenity Gardens, and I found it to be a place of unusual tranquility. The atmosphere that had been so charged and intense during Mrs. Thorne's episodes had settled into something more peaceful, as if the consciousness energies that had been so active during her stay had found a state of rest and harmony. The facility's administration was aware of Mrs. Thorne's unusual case, but they chose to handle it discreetly. They didn't seek publicity or attention, instead focusing on ensuring that all patients received the best possible care regardless of any unusual experiences they might report. The staff became more attentive to patients' accounts of dreams, visions, or strange sensations, treating these reports with respect rather than dismissal. While I never encountered another case as dramatic as Mrs. Thorne's, I began paying closer attention to my patients' reports of unusual experiences. Some of these experiences, when quietly investigated, proved to have elements that were difficult to explain through conventional means. Patients would describe deceased individuals with remarkable accuracy or provide details about historical events they had never studied. While none of these cases approached the extraordinary nature of Mrs. Thorne's experiences, they suggested that consciousness might be more complex and resilient than we had realized. The legacy of Mrs. Thorne's case extended into my personal life as well. Her experiences had fundamentally changed my understanding of death and dying, transforming my approach not just to my work, but to my own mortality. I no longer feared death as an absolute ending, but saw it as a transition into something that might be different, but not necessarily final. This shift in perspective affected my relationships with family and friends, particularly during times of loss and grief. I found myself able to offer comfort and hope that went beyond conventional religious or philosophical consolations. While I couldn't promise that consciousness survived death, I could share the possibility that Mrs. Thorne's case had revealed, that death might not be the absolute boundary we had always assumed it to be. As I eventually transitioned to a new position at another hospice facility, I carried with me not just the memory of Mrs. Thorne's extraordinary case, but a fundamentally transformed understanding of what it meant to care for the dying. I had learned that consciousness might be far more mysterious and resilient than we had ever imagined, that the boundaries between individual minds might be more fluid than we realized, and that death might not be an ending but a transformation into something we were only beginning to understand. The patient who changed everything for me was Mrs. Vivian Thorne, a woman whose unique abilities had provided a glimpse into possibilities that challenged everything we thought we knew about consciousness, memory, and the nature of human existence. Her legacy lived on not in scientific publications or public recognition, but in the quiet transformation of perspective she had created in those of us who had witnessed her extraordinary journey. Mrs. Thorne had shown us that the mystery of consciousness was far more profound than we had ever imagined, that the boundary between life and death might be more permeable than we had dared to hope, and that the connections we form with others might persist in ways we were only beginning to comprehend. I never spoke publicly about Mrs. Thorne's case. It remained a private experience, shared only with those who had witnessed it firsthand, and a few trusted colleagues who understood the delicate nature of what we had observed. But the impact of her story continued to influence my work and my understanding of what it meant to care for the dying. Years later, I still think about Mrs. Thorne and the extraordinary abilities she had displayed during her final weeks. I wonder if there are others like her, people who possess the rare sensitivity to access the consciousness patterns that might linger in certain places. I wonder if Margaret and Thomas are still there, in that room, waiting for the next sensitive soul who might be able to hear their voices. What I know for certain is that Mrs. Thorne changed everything for me. She transformed my understanding of death from an ending into a transition, from a boundary into a doorway. She showed me that the work of a hospice nurse involves more than just providing comfort during the dying process. It involves bearing witness to the full mystery of human consciousness and the profound connections that bind us all together. On my last night at Serenity Gardens, I spent a few minutes alone in Mrs. Thorne's former room. The space was quiet, peaceful, but there was something else, a presence that felt both familiar and comforting. I found myself thinking about Margaret and Thomas, about their stories and their connection to this place. And for just a moment, I could have sworn I heard the faint sound of classical music drifting through the air and felt the gentle touch of a protective hand on my shoulder. I turned around, but the room was empty. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe it never had been. In the end, Mrs. Thorne's greatest gift was not the answers she had provided, but the questions she had raised. Questions about the nature of consciousness, the possibility of survival after death, and the mysterious connections that bind us all together. Her extraordinary case had opened a window into mysteries that humanity had pondered for millennia, offering hope that death might not be the absolute ending we had always feared. The room was quiet now, but it was never just quiet again, and somehow that made all the difference. The weeks following Mrs. Thorne's death brought a period of quiet reflection that would fundamentally alter my understanding of hospice care and the nature of human consciousness. While the extraordinary phenomenon we had witnessed seemed to have died with her, the implications of her case continued to reverberate through every aspect of my work and personal life. Dr. Amanda Thorne remained deeply involved in analyzing the limited data we had collected during her mother's stay. The recordings of Mrs. Thorne's episodes formed a small but comprehensive archive that she studied privately, sharing her findings only with a select few colleagues who specialized in consciousness research. What emerged from this analysis was a portrait of consciousness that challenged many assumptions about the nature of human identity and memory. The evidence we had gathered was compelling, but incomplete. Dr. Thorne had managed to verify some of Mrs. Thorne's claims through historical records. The fire in the 1960s had indeed occurred, and there were fragmentary references to both Margaret and Thomas in various documents. But many details remained unconfirmed, existing in the gaps between official records and family memories. What my mother experienced may never be fully explained, Dr. Thorne told me during one of our final conversations about the case. But the consistency of her accounts, the emotional authenticity of her episodes, and the historical details she provided suggest that something extraordinary was happening. Whether it was genuine consciousness transfer or some unknown neurological phenomenon, it deserves to be documented and remembered. Dr. Thorne brought in Dr. Sarah Kellerman, a neuropsychologist, to conduct a discrete analysis of the recordings. Dr. Kellerman was fascinated by Mrs. Thorne's case, but cautious about drawing any definitive conclusions. What we observed challenges our understanding of how consciousness and memory work, Dr. Kellerman explained after several weeks of study. Mrs. Thorne was accessing information that she had never learned, displaying personality traits that weren't her own, speaking with knowledge that predates her birth. The neurological damage from her Alzheimer's should have made these kinds of detailed, coherent memories impossible. But without being able to replicate these conditions or study similar cases, we can only document what we observed, not explain it. The most compelling aspect of Dr. Kellerman's analysis was her documentation of the distinct personality patterns that emerged during Mrs. Thorne's episodes. When channeling Margaret, Mrs. Thorne consistently displayed specific mannerisms, speech patterns, and emotional responses that were completely unlike her baseline personality. When accessing Thomas's memories, she exhibited different but equally consistent behavioral traits. These weren't variations of Mrs. Thorne's personality, Dr. Kellerman concluded. They were distinct psychological profiles that remained stable across multiple episodes. The consistency suggests that she was accessing genuine personality patterns that had somehow been preserved after death. During one particularly intense episode that we had recorded, Mrs. Thorne channeled a conversation between Margaret and Thomas that revealed details about their relationship that we had never heard before. Speaking as Margaret, she described how Thomas had been kind to her during her final illness, bringing her flowers from the garden and sitting with her during her worst days. When channeling Thomas, she spoke of Margaret's courage in facing death and how her peaceful passing had given him hope during his own final moments years later. They knew each other, Doctor, Thorne observed as we reviewed the recording. Not just as people who had lived in the same house, but as friends who had formed a genuine connection across time. My mother was somehow accessing not just their individual memories, but the emotional bonds between them. This revelation added another layer of complexity to Mrs. Thorne's case. If she was indeed accessing the consciousness of the deceased, she wasn't just channeling isolated individuals. She was tapping into a network of relationships and connections that had persisted beyond death. As the months passed, I found myself returning again and again to the recordings of Mrs. Thorne's episodes. Each time I listened, I discovered new details that I had missed during the actual events. The way her voice would change when channeling different personalities, the specific mannerisms she would adopt, the emotional authenticity of her accounts, all of it pointed to something far more complex than simple confabulation or false memory. But it was the emotional impact of her story that affected me most profoundly. Mrs. Thorne's experiences had forced me to confront fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness and death that I had never seriously considered before. If consciousness could somehow survive death and be accessed by others, what would that mean for how we understand human existence? What did it mean for how we cared for the dying? These questions began to influence every aspect of my work. I started paying closer attention to my patients' final words, listening for references to people or events that might not be part of their own memories. I became more sensitive to changes in personality or behavior that might indicate something beyond ordinary confusion or medication effects. While I never encountered another case as dramatic as Mrs. Thorne's, I began to notice subtle patterns that I had previously overlooked. Patients would sometimes speak with knowledge they shouldn't have possessed, or display personality traits that were completely unlike their usual behavior. These episodes were brief and easily dismissed as confusion, but they occurred with enough frequency to make me wonder if consciousness transfer might be more common than we realized. One older man, dying of cancer, spent his final days speaking fluent Italian, despite having no known connection to Italy or the Italian language. His family was baffled, but when I researched the history of his room, I discovered that an Italian immigrant had died there in the 1980s. The connection might have been coincidental, but it reminded me of Mrs. Thorne's case and made me wonder if some places might be more conducive to consciousness phenomena than others. A woman with dementia began playing piano pieces that she had never learned, her fingers moving across an imaginary keyboard with surprising skill and precision. When I asked her about the music, she said she was playing Margaret's favorite songs. There was no way she could have known about Margaret Whitfield, but the coincidence was unsettling. These incidents were subtle and could easily be explained by conventional means, but they occurred frequently enough to suggest that consciousness might be more fluid and transferable than we had ever imagined. Perhaps Mrs. Thorne's extraordinary sensitivity had allowed us to observe and document what was normally a subtle and overlooked aspect of the dying process. The room where Mrs. Thorne had stayed became something of a sanctuary within our facility. Subsequent patients who occupied the space often reported unusually peaceful experiences, vivid dreams, and a sense of comfort that they couldn't quite explain. Some spoke of feeling watched over by benevolent presences, of sensing that they were not alone during their final days. I made a point of spending time in that room whenever possible, and I found it to be a place of unusual tranquility and reflection. The atmosphere that had been so charged and intense during Mrs. Thorne's episodes had settled into something more peaceful, but there was still an undercurrent of something extraordinary, a sense that the boundaries between life and death were somehow thinner in that space. The facility's administration was aware of Mrs. Thorne's unusual case, but they chose to handle it with discretion. They didn't seek publicity or attention, instead focusing on ensuring that all patients received the best possible care regardless of any unusual experiences they might report. The staff became more attentive to patients' accounts of dreams, visions, or strange sensations, treating these reports with respect rather than automatic dismissal. This shift in approach had a profound impact on the culture of our facility. Patients seemed more comfortable sharing their experiences, knowing that they would be listened to rather than dismissed. Families reported feeling more supported during the difficult process of saying goodbye to their loved ones. The acknowledgement that death might involve mysteries beyond our current understanding seemed to provide comfort rather than fear. Dr. Amanda Thorne eventually wrote a private account of her mother's case, but she chose not to seek publication. Instead, she shared it only with a small circle of trusted colleagues who were studying consciousness and near-death experiences. She felt that her mother's story was too precious and too vulnerable to be subjected to public scrutiny or skepticism. My mother's experience was extraordinary, but it was also deeply personal, Dr. Thorne explained. I want to honor her memory by preserving her story, but I also want to protect it from those who might exploit or sensationalize it. Some truths are too important to be turned into entertainment. The research conducted during Mrs. Thorne's stay contributed to a small but growing body of literature on consciousness studies and anomalous experiences in terminal care. While the mechanisms behind her abilities remained unexplained, the documentation of her case provided valuable data for researchers exploring the nature of human consciousness. Dr. Kellerman incorporated some of her findings into her ongoing research on consciousness and memory, though she was careful not to make any definitive claims about the nature of Mrs. Thorne's experiences. We observed something extraordinary, she would tell colleagues, but we must be humble about what we can and cannot explain. For the families of patients at Serenity Gardens, Mrs. Thorne's story provided both comfort and wonder. Many found solace in the possibility that consciousness survived death, that their loved ones might continue to exist in some form after their physical bodies failed. The story was shared quietly, passed from family to family as a source of hope during difficult times. The legacy of Mrs. Thorne's case extended into my personal life as well. Her experiences had fundamentally changed my understanding of death and dying, transforming my approach not just to my work, but to my own mortality. I no longer feared death as an absolute ending, but saw it as a transition into something that might be different, but not necessarily final. This shift in perspective affected my relationships with family and friends, particularly during times of loss and grief. I found myself able to offer comfort and hope that went beyond conventional religious or philosophical consolations. While I couldn't promise that consciousness survived death, I could share the possibility that Mrs. Thorne's case had revealed, that death might not be the absolute boundary we had always assumed it to be. The transformation in my understanding was gradual but profound. Before Mrs. Thorne, I had approached death with professional competence but emotional distance. I provided comfort and care, but I viewed death as a medical event, the cessation of biological function. After witnessing her extraordinary abilities, I began to see death as something far more mysterious and potentially meaningful. I started to notice things I had previously overlooked. The way some patients seemed to gain clarity and peace in their final moments, as if they were seeing or understanding something beyond the physical world. The frequency with which dying patients spoke of deceased relatives or friends was often with remarkable specificity and emotion. The sense of presence that many families reported feeling in the rooms of their departed loved ones. These observations didn't prove anything definitive, but they suggested that the boundary between life and death might be more complex and permeable than we had ever imagined. Mrs. Thorne's case had opened my eyes to possibilities that I had never seriously considered, and once opened, they could never be closed again. As I eventually transitioned to a new position at another hospice facility, I carried with me not just the memory of Mrs. Thorne's extraordinary case, but a fundamentally transformed understanding of what it meant to care for the dying. I had learned that consciousness might be far more mysterious and resilient than we had ever imagined, that the boundaries between individual minds might be more fluid than we realized, and that death might not be an ending, but a transformation into something we were only beginning to understand. The patient who changed everything for me was Mrs. Vivian Thorne, a woman whose unique abilities had provided a glimpse into possibilities that challenged everything we thought we knew about consciousness, memory, and the nature of human existence. Her legacy lived on not in scientific publications or public recognition, but in the quiet transformation of perspective she had created in those of us who had witnessed her extraordinary journey. Mrs. Thorne had shown us that the mystery of consciousness was far deeper than we had ever imagined, that the boundary between life and death might be more permeable than we had dared to hope, and that the connections we form with others might persist in ways we were only beginning to comprehend. Her story reminded us that there was still so much we didn't understand about the human experience, and that sometimes the most profound truths came from the most unexpected sources. I never spoke publicly about Mrs. Thorne's case. It remained a private experience, shared only with those who had witnessed it firsthand, and a few trusted colleagues who understood the delicate nature of what we had observed. But the impact of her story continued to influence my work and my understanding of what it meant to care for the dying. Years later, I still think about Mrs. Thorne and the extraordinary abilities she had displayed during her final weeks. I wonder if there are others like her, people who possess the rare sensitivity to access the consciousness patterns that might linger in certain places. I wonder if Margaret and Thomas are still there, in that room, waiting for the next sensitive soul who might be able to hear their voices. What I know for certain is that Mrs. Thorne changed everything for me. She transformed my understanding of death from an ending into a transition, from a boundary into a doorway. She showed me that the work of a hospice nurse involves more than just providing comfort during the dying process. It involves bearing witness to the full mystery of human consciousness and the profound connections that bind us all together across the boundaries of life and death. Her story remains with me as a reminder that there is still so much we don't understand about the nature of human existence, and that sometimes the most extraordinary truths are revealed not through scientific study or academic research, but through the quiet, intimate moments we share with those who are making the ultimate transition from life to whatever comes after.